The man was horrified to discover that this fungus, which scientists had identified as harmless, seemed to want to devour him. If he hadn't just turned on the light, he might have already become its next meal. He would have been its dinner. As a biology teacher, Hank took a sample of it. When he turned off the light, the time went back 15 years. Back then, this black fungus had just arrived in the town. At that time, scientists didn't notice anything unusual, and people got used to living with it. Hank, on the other hand, was a promising football player, with money and beautiful women at his fingertips. But during the game that night, at some point, a mass of black fungus quietly wrapped around Hank's ankle. The tremendous impact forced him to say goodbye to his sports career for good, and what was even harder for him to accept was that his girlfriend Stacy also turned to his best friend. The two of them even had a child soon after. Fortunately, Hank became a biology teacher. Life was still manageable for him though. Recently, Stacy's daughter Grace transferred into his class. Her appearance showed no signs of repression. In fact, she even looked a bit like him. He opened his old beat-up car. He still kept photos of his ex-girlfriend as treasured possessions. In the folding mirror, the frustrated Hank finally returned home. That was when the scene at the beginning happened. On weekend nights, Hank still had to work at the bar his father left him. But that night, a strange man walked into the bar. Hank poured him a glass of whiskey, which the man downed in one gulp, but the next second he vomited it all out. Hank hurriedly called the hospital, and just then, at that moment, a black cat walked up to the man. The man suddenly extended his tentacles, trying to attack him. Hank quickly dodged and, using all his strength, broke off a decorative antler. Then he fiercely stabbed it into the man's body, but it didn't cause even the slightest bit of harm. Seeing that the man was about to strike a fatal blow, in a panic, Hank raised the signboard. Hank rushed out of the bar just as the police arrived. He was about to tell them what had just happened, but noticed that something seemed off about their condition. Hank hurriedly made up an excuse and tried to leave in his car. Not good, not good. Come on, Darcy, come on, Darcy, come on, Darcy. The police stood in front of him. By his car, they raved that being possessed was an absolutely wonderful experience. Then they invited him to join them as well. But Hank didn't care about any of that. But the police car was relentlessly chasing from behind. Hank floored the gas pedal so hard that sparks flew, yet he still couldn't shake them off. Out of nowhere, some scattered Genjin tried to climb up. Hank hurriedly rolled up the car window, but in that brief moment of distraction, a cow possessed by Genjin suddenly appeared in front of him. Hank drove to the high school graduation party, worried about Grace's safety. So he rushed into the villa to warn everyone to leave immediately, but clearly, no one took his words seriously. In fact, Grace's boyfriend Dylan even thought he was a pervert. Helpless, Hank had no choice but to turn around and leave, while the others continued drinking heavily. Grace collapsed onto the bed, completely unaware that Dylan had already started flirting with another girl. Meanwhile, the man was in front of the bathroom mirror. Suddenly, a blob of black slime dripped onto his face. The next second, on the other side, countless black hands suddenly appeared in the swimming pool. In an instant, they were dragged into the water. Meanwhile, the villa had already turned into a living hell. These tentacles were everywhere, relentlessly devouring the crowd. At that moment, Dylan suddenly felt a wet sensation on her hand, but when she snapped back to her senses, the girl who had just been so affectionate with her had already become a host to the Genjun parasite. Meanwhile, Grace was still asleep, seemingly awakened by the screams ringing in her ears. It was only then that Grace realized a huge mass of Genjun had already gathered above her head. Fortunately, she reacted quickly and used the blanket to block Genjun's invasion. At this critical moment, Hank returned, and they hurried to escape. But outside, monsters had already taken positions, guarding the exit even though the door was barricaded. These terrifying Genjun still managed to squeeze in through various gaps. At this critical moment, it turned out the military had finally sent people to handle the situation. They gathered everyone in a supermarket and then explained, for the past 15 years, the Genjun had been in a dormant state, only recently entering an active phase. It was estimated that it would take at least another 5 years before they fell dormant again. During this period, they needed to seal all doors and windows. No one was allowed outside, and everyone could only rely on their own luck. But these freedom-loving fools thought this was just a conspiracy by the American government. The next morning, as the sun rose, everything seems to have returned to calm once again. People cleaned up the remains of the deity by the roadside, and then resumed their normal lives. Although there were many more missing person notices posted around the town, strangely, those who had been possessed by the deity last night also gradually woke up one after another. Hank wanted to escape this town, But when he returned to the bar, he discovered that someone who had died long ago, his father, who had been dead for many years, suddenly appeared before his eyes. It turned out that after his father was buried many years ago, his corpse underground had already been taken over by the deity. Then, his father explained that these deities, though they seemed evil, were actually the Earth's restorative agents. They could bring the dead back to life, but could also devour human life. If Hank was willing, he could even immediately cure the other person's lame leg. His father extended his hand, offering him an olive branch. The scene shifts to the high school graduation dance, which arrives as scheduled. Hank finds Stacy, wanting to ask her whether Grace is really his daughter, but after receiving a negative answer. Afterwards, the heartbroken Hank goes to the edge of a cliff. He feels as if the whole town is sick, even though danger is clearly lurking nearby. No matter how hard he tries, no one is willing to believe him. And although Stacy has long since married and become a mother, Hank still can't forget her in his heart. She is his unattainable love. Perhaps fate has given him another chance to live. But just then, the lights in the town began to go out rapidly. Clearly, the real culprit had started a new round of attacks. Hank suddenly remembered that tonight was the graduation dance and Grace would be there too. He didn't dare waste any time and hurriedly limped back home. Then he gathered all the ultraviolet lamps in the room and strapped them to himself. But just then, he noticed Stacy's husband, the man who had stolen his wife, had parked his car by the roadside. It seemed he was waiting to pick up his wife and child from school. Hank knocked on the car window and warned him to leave immediately, but the other man just looked at him with a dismissive attitude. But soon he couldn't keep smiling, as countless true monarchs swarmed toward the car. Then they crawled into the car through the air conditioning system. Hank realized that his ultraviolet lamps were completely ineffective at driving the true monarchs out of the car. Seeing that his life was in imminent danger, he hurriedly pleaded for mercy. Meanwhile, Zhenjun launched an attack on the students, and the scene was instantly filled with screams of agony. At the same time, Grace was taken by Dylan to a secluded room. She seemed to sense a change in her boyfriend. Just as Grace was about to refuse, the other party roughly grabbed her arm. At this critical moment, Hank rushed in. He exposed Dylan's true identity and was about to take Grace away, but the elevator had already been sealed off by Zhenjun. The two had no choice but to hide in a nearby laboratory. The ultraviolet lamps on their bodies were ruined by water, so Hank had to take off his clothes. Dylan grabbed a hammer and chased Hank, making him cover his head and run away in panic. Suddenly, Dylan turned to Grace. Hank took the chance, grabbed a chainsaw, and stabbed it through Dylan, but this injury was nothing compared to how fast Zhenjun could heal. At that moment, Grace started mocking him, belittling his manhood and making him feel worthless. What man could tolerate that? Just as he was about to strike ruthlessly, meanwhile, Zhenjun had already slaughtered everyone in the entire school. Only a couple was left, forced into the corner of the classroom. The two had no choice but to climb up to the ceiling, where the space was big enough for them to keep dodging and maneuvering. Hank suddenly thought of the stadium lights. They were bright enough. Although they couldn't kill Zhenjun like sunlight, at least they could buy everyone some time. Hank grabbed a hammer and smashed the glass. Then, the four of them rushed toward the stadium and finally made it to the control room after much difficulty. But the wires had been cut, and every time the power was restored, it had to be restarted from scratch. Hank pulled down the circuit breaker and told the others to reconnect the wires. The most dangerous task, however, he took on himself. Fully buffed, Hank limped to the center of the stadium, all the while being careful not to step on Zhenjun beneath his feet. But even though the circuit breaker was within arm's reach, he was still just a little too far away. Suddenly, Hank was knocked flying. A monster formed a barrier in front of him, just to stop him from pulling down the circuit breaker. Facing this deadly situation, Hank picked up the football lying on the ground. Relying on muscle memory from 15 years ago, he threw it toward the circuit breaker. All the real soldiers were frozen in place. Just as Hank was about to take the other survivors to hide under the lights, they suddenly went out. It turned out that these real soldiers had started to destroy the circuits from underground. Seeing the lights go out one by one, everyone had no choice but to run towards the signal. But if they were not careful, they would become the mouths of the real soldiers. Screams were heard in their ears. Although Hank's legs and feet did not move, he still climbed upwards separately. Suddenly, Grace's skirt was caught. Hank had to let go to help her out. The other three finally climbed to the top. The sun showed a ray of light, but just as Hank was about to The monster transformed by the real army was about to climb up when it lost its activity under the sunlight. The four people just breathed a sigh of relief, but a dark cloud suddenly blocked the sun, and several black tentacles rose towards them again. At this moment, everyone had no ability to resist. Saying goodbye to the person they love most in the world might be the only thing they could do. Just as the real army gradually swallowed everyone up, the real army in the town instantly lost its activity under the sunlight, and then fell into hibernation again. After that, the lives of the remaining people gradually returned to normal, but how long could such a peaceful life last?